One of my earliest memories, and it is still vivid in my mind, of how words wounded me occurred when I was in late elementary school. I rode my bike to the Little League tryouts, which were being held in a school gym. The ball that was hit in my direction was coming at a fast speed. I let it pass me by, turned, and caught it as it rebounded off the gym wall. When I threw it back, the coach simply said, "Kid, there is no wall on the field. You can go home." Those words hurt. They smacked of failure, no second chance, and no opportunity to learn a sport from a caring coach. As a successful surgeon, I was sued by a person who had a bad disease that was going to have an unfortunate outcome. Although the ultimate decision was that I had done nothing wrong, the words that came from the patient's lawyer were harsh and implied that I was incompetent to do my job. I remember wondering, ever so hesitantly, was there any truth in those charges? Was I incompetent? In today's heated and rancorous political environment, most of us have, at one time or another, either offended or been offended by nasty words that are so easily thrown around in speech and on social media. Our conversation has great potential to be very dangerous. The phrase, loose cannon, was first used in 1874 by Victor Hugo in his novel 93. It refers to cannons that were carried on wooden warships in the 17th and 18th centuries. These cannons were on rollers and secured with heavy ropes to prevent them from rolling on the deck and to control the kickback when the cannon was fired. A loose cannon was a great danger to the ship and the crew. Read James 3, 1 through 12. In what ways can the tongue be like a loose cannon? Not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. We all stumble in many ways. Anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect, able to keep their whole body in check. When we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships as an example. Although they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder, wherever the pilot wants it to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. All kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and sea creatures are being tamed and have been tamed by mankind. But no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers and sisters, can a fig tree bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. This concept of a loose cannon is today applied to a person who is behaving poorly with no restraints in place. At work, you might have been advised to be careful around a certain employee because when they got frustrated, they became a loose cannon, with the results being utter chaos. James will make the case that we need to be aware that our tongue is a dangerous and powerful instrument that needs to be controlled lest damage and chaos follow in its wake. James begins chapter 3 with the words, "Not many of you should presume to be teachers, my brothers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. We all stumble in many ways." Certainly, James is giving a warning to anyone who was thinking about becoming a teacher, and it is this warning that will lead James into a more general teaching about the dangers of the tongue. Teachers were very prominent in the early church, and they are with us today. The position of a teacher was similar to that of the rabbi in the Jewish community. In 1 Corinthians 12, Paul ranks teacher third after apostles and prophets. But right up front, James says that we who teach will be judged more strictly. He is including himself in the admonitions that follow. Each and every one of us who in some way teach, whether it is in the church, the family, or society, must be very careful and realize that the admonitions James is going to give will apply even more strictly to us. So, with that caution and admonition, let us see what James has to say. When he says that we all stumble in many ways, he does not simply mean that we frequently mess up, but that we mess up or stumble in many different ways. What's the big deal? James says if a person could control their speech, they would be perfect and able to control their whole body. We might be saved, we might believe all the right truths about God, but as Paul writes in Romans 7, we still possess a sin nature. We have the corrupt nature inherited from the first Adam and the new nature from the last Adam, Jesus Christ. There is no person in this world who does not sin in some area of life. It might be intentional sin. It might be a slip-up. The Jews knew this. The writer of Ecclesiastes says, "There is not a righteous man on earth who does what is right and never sins." The secular world knows this. The first century Roman philosopher Seneca said, "We all sin, some more grievously, some more lightly." In 1 John 1 we read, "If we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us." Even the Apostle Peter, on whom Christ built the church, denied Christ. We know what is in our heart by what comes out of our mouth. Having control of our tongue does not make one perfect, but a perfect person has control of their tongue. Only the perfect, sinless Jesus had control of his tongue. James begins with the tongue, a tiny member of our physical body. The average tongue is 3 inches long. It's all muscle, actually 8 different muscles intertwined with each other. You and I may be tempted to say it is not necessary to make a big deal out of the words we speak, but James says otherwise. The results of our words, our little words from our little tongue, are a big deal, and in order to make his point, he uses 3 illustrations that were well known to his audience. James uses the illustration of a bit to control the movement of a large horse. If you can control the horse's mouth, you control the horse's actions. The ancients knew how this worked. The fact that humans could domesticate and control the animal kingdom was a pillar of their thinking. Next, James uses the illustration of a ship's rudder. Whether the ship is driven by an engine or by the wind, it is the rudder that controls the direction of sail. In general, the surface area of a rudder is 2% of the underwater surface area of the boat. There's no exact science here. It depends on the boat and what you're trying to do. The point is, the rudder is a very small but very critical part of the boat. We were motoring to an island 14 miles out from the main coast when the steering mechanism to the rudder broke. My sturdy son-in-law, who was assigned to manually control the rudder, will readily attest to the significance and power of that little part of the boat. Finally, James uses the illustration of a spark of fire. Over the years, California has had thousands of acres of forest land destroyed by fires, many of which began as a single spark. James not only says that the tongue is like a bit that can control a large animal, or like a rudder that can turn a ship, but he says that the tongue is a fire. Both the bit and the rudder, which turn the horse or the ship, need someone to control them. Not so with a little spark. James's point is simply this: a misspoken word here or there, a criticism, a falsehood, or some fake news, all have the potential to grow from something small to affecting and or controlling large numbers of people. The NIV translates verse 6 as, The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole person, sets the whole course of his life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. Although a small part of our body, the tongue is the most difficult to control and becomes the vehicle by which we express the evil of the world that is in us. James notes that this fire not only corrupts the person, but also sets the whole course of his life on fire. As one commentator wrote, the evil influence of the tongue spreads out from the axle to the entire circumference of the wheel at every moment in its revolving course. Jesus said in Matthew 15 that it was what comes out of our mouth that makes us unclean. The mouth expresses our heart, wherein we find evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, and slander. James states that the tongue has the ability to corrupt us and set the whole course of our life on fire. One might think of the destruction that a firearm can cause, but that has to be driven by the actions of an individual. Likewise, the tongue is driven by the condition of the heart. James says in verse 7 that man has been able to train and control all of God's creation, but we still cannot control our tongue. We need to confess our sins and plead as David did, "Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me." This small member of our body is, as James says, a restless evil, full of deadly poison. Here is a paradox, for just as fire contained can cook your meal or heat your home, so too poison, curare, contained can relax your muscles for surgery, or a narcotic can relieve physical pain. In this letter, James will use the illustration of doubleness frequently. Here in verse 9 of chapter 3, he shows the double standard of the tongue that praises God and curses humans. Let's take a step back and remember that blessing and cursing have their origin in God's own speech. In Deuteronomy 30, God, through Moses, sets out two alternatives for the Israelites. "This day I call heaven and earth as witness against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses." In Romans 12, Paul spoke against cursing, and yet in 1 Corinthians, he suggests that the church hand over to Satan a person involved with sexual immorality. The effect of such a curse was separation from God. This is different from the way we would curse one another. What James is referring to here is the abusive language that we use against each other. In Luke 6, Jesus told his disciples to bless those who curse you. We do curse our fellow humans. And what makes it so evil is that our fellow human being was created in the image of the God who we bless and praise. For James, the greatest evil here is the doubleness of the tongue. He uses three illustrations to make his point that a pure heart and an impure double-tongued speech are incompatible. The first is that you cannot have a spring that at one moment produces pure water and another day produces bitter or salt water. The second is that a fig tree does not produce olives. And thirdly, he asks, can a salt spring produce fresh water? Through the use of commonplace analogies, James helps his readers feel the weight their words carry. In so doing, he encourages us to choose our words carefully. Now it's your turn. Read James 4:11 through 12. And come to your group prepared to answer the following questions. What is the connection between slandering someone and judging them? James ends his letter by encouraging his readers to help other believers who have wandered from the truth. How can we do this without becoming our neighbor's judge?